Imagine arriving in an ancient city needing work. There is no searchable list showing everyone the same openings. But that does not mean nobody is hiring. It means the information is scattered across systems that do not speak to everyone equally. A household may already contain the labor it needs. A workshop can train a young person into a trade. A city can recruit a specialist for a public project. A producer can hire additional workers when demand suddenly rises. These are not primitive versions of one modern job market. They are different labor systems operating side by side. So the first answer is this. Ancient people reached work through the local structure connecting labor to demand. That structure might be a household, workshop, institution, contractor, or public project. What someone could hear about and how their ability became visible depended on which structure they could enter. But that creates an important distinction. Some people actively sought an employer or contract. Others were already inside a system that organized their labor. Before asking how an ancient worker got hired, we first have to ask whether that person was ever outside the workforce to begin with. Sometimes the answer was no. In early Mesopotamia, some institutions administered groups of workers they already knew. One clay tablet from Girsu, written in the 24th century BCE, records barley rations for roughly 200 workers and their children. Adults and children received different monthly amounts. This is not a vacancy notice, and it does not tell us how any one person first entered the workforce. It is an administrative record of people already inside a labor system the institution maintained. That distinction is easy to miss. If a worker already belonged to such a group, the immediate problem was not discovering an opening. The institution already knew where that person fit. But one tablet cannot represent all Mesopotamian labor. Household production, independent work, and institutionally organized labor could exist in the same society. The ration list reveals one powerful arrangement, not an entire economy. It explains a workforce already inside the system. It does not explain how someone entered a skilled trade their own household could not teach them. For that, the entrance was training. Training was not always something a parent could provide at home. A family might have to place a young person inside someone else's workshop. For many skilled trades, that relationship came before anything resembling a job search. You could not simply decide to become a weaver, potter, shoemaker, or stoneworker. You needed tools, materials, instruction, and repeated practice. The workshop became both a workplace and an entrance. Formal apprenticeship existed in more than one ancient setting. Evidence from 4th century BCE Athens shows that such arrangements were known there, while papyri from Roman Egypt preserve them in much greater detail. One agreement placed a young man named Thonis with a weaver for 5 years. Another placed Passion with a weaver through an arrangement negotiated by his brothers and connected to a family loan. The human reality is easy to overlook. A young person could leave the familiar rules of home and enter a workplace controlled by another adult. The arrangement might provide training, support, income, or a future trade. It could also impose long hours and obligations negotiated by someone else. So families did not always pass down a complete profession. Sometimes they provided something more basic: access to the person who could teach it. Training opened a route into skilled work, but it took time, and ancient employers did not always have years. Sometimes a workshop, estate, or public project needed additional workers immediately. Ancient employers could respond by bringing in labor beyond their permanent households. Public building records from classical Greece show officials using several arrangements at once. Workers could be hired directly, paid for time or for a defined quantity of work, or organized through contractors responsible for completing part of a larger project. The surviving accounts make this process unusually visible. They record materials being purchased, stone being quarried and transported, workers being paid, and portions of construction being assigned and supervised. A monumental building may look like the achievement of one city, but its completion depended on many smaller agreements with people supplying labor and expertise. Roman producers also hired short-term assistants when their existing workforce was not enough. Agricultural writers describe particular stages of work being entrusted to hired workers or contractors rather than performed entirely by the estate's regular organization. To the worker, the opportunity might not resemble a permanent job. It could be one phase of construction, one quantity of material to process, or one contract that ended when the task was complete. So ancient people were not limited to occupations inherited through family or entered through apprenticeship. Employers could actively obtain additional labor when they needed it. But finding someone available was only the beginning. Before assigning valuable materials, public money, or an unfinished project to a worker, someone had to decide whether that person could actually complete the job. Ancient employers had no universal resume or certification system, but they could turn a worker's promise into something other people were willing to risk money on. A surviving building contract from the Greek city of Lebedea shows how demanding that could be. The contractor had to follow precise instructions, begin within a fixed period, employ craftsmen considered competent in the trade, and provide guarantors. Those guarantors did not perform the work, but they remained financially tied to the contractor's success. If penalties went unpaid, the consequences could reach beyond the person holding the tools. Someone else had agreed to stand behind him. The contractor also did not receive everything simply because the work had begun. Payments came in stages. Part of the money remained withheld. Damaged material could have to be replaced at the contractor's expense, and workers convicted of poor practice could be removed. The final portion arrived only after the work had been examined and approved. The contract could not prove in advance that every craftsman was skilled. Instead, it surrounded the work with accountability. Specifications defined what had to be delivered. Guarantors made failure costly. Inspection made the result visible. Outside public projects, proof was probably less formal. Previous work, a known workshop, or an earlier commission could help an employer judge whether someone was worth trusting. But there was no single ancient credential that worked for everyone. Sometimes proving yourself meant completing the work while your payment, your materials, and another person's guarantee remained at risk. And that reveals an uncomfortable distinction. The person holding the tools was not always the person holding the agreement. On a public project, an individual craft worker might shape stone beneath a contractor whose name carried the responsibility. The worker's hands completed the task, but the surviving contract might speak mainly about the contractor, the payment schedule, the guarantors, and the finished result. An apprentice stood in a different relationship. Thonis entered a weaver's workshop through an agreement made by his guardian. Passian's arrangement was negotiated by his brothers. Training could offer skill, income, and a future trade, but the apprentice might begin that future inside conditions already set by other people. An enslaved artisan occupied a legally different position again. Roman slaveholders could hire out skilled enslaved workers, and some of those workers exercised considerable judgment in their daily tasks. They could become known for specialized ability. None of that erased the fact that another person retained legal power over their labor. A free wage worker was not in the same position. He might negotiate his own employment, accept a temporary task, or move between employers. But legal freedom did not guarantee security, equal bargaining power, or the ability to refuse work without consequence. These experiences cannot be collapsed into one story of helplessness. The apprentice might benefit from training. The wage worker might possess real mobility. The enslaved artisan might exercise expertise and practical independence. But the same questions follow each arrangement. Who chose the relationship? Who received the payment? Who carried the risk? And who had the recognized right to end it? Ancient societies had many effective ways to connect people with work. What differed was how much control the person doing the work possessed over that connection. And visibility, not fairness, is the crucial difference. Ancient people did find work. Some entered labor systems that already contained them. Some learned a trade inside another person's workshop. Some were recruited for a public project, a short contract, or a defined piece of work. Others performed labor through arrangements negotiated by a contractor, guardian, household head, or owner. There was no single ancient method because work did not move through one integrated labor market. A public job listing would not have erased these inequalities. Seeing an opening does not guarantee the training to qualify for it, the freedom to accept it, the power to negotiate its terms, or the security to walk away. But visibility changes the starting point. A listing separates one fact, the existence of an opportunity, from the private relationship carrying that information. You can learn that the work exists before a master accepts you, before a contractor knows your name, or before a household decides where you belong. Ancient people did not live without ways to find or allocate work. They lived inside many of them, household by household, workshop by workshop, contract by contract, each revealing work mainly to the people already close enough to see it. What they generally lacked was a common, standardized window through which many kinds of work could be seen. A job listing does not make work fair. It does something quieter. It lets a stranger discover that the door exists before anyone has decided whether they belong on the other side. For many ancient workers, work was not only something you did, it was a relationship you had to enter, and sometimes one you were born inside. The modern promise is not that every door will open. It is that for one brief moment, the door can be seen before the gatekeeper sees you.